systematically we have lied about everything involving Russia and Ukraine now for months, if not years. And the truth of the matter is that people have never been told or not being told, and you can find the truth, but you've got to look for it, obviously, on the internet, is that Russia is by no means the evil aggressor in this thing. If anything, Russia launched an operation that it felt it had to secure its country. We have been working tirelessly for at least the last 20 years to undermine and weaken Russia in whatever way possible. We decided we didn't care much for Mr. Putin and his success at essentially retrieving Russia from the ash heap of history. And then the Russians made it very clear that they would not accept NATO on its borders. I mean, effectively, they'd done that with Latvia and Estonia. They do have a border up there. But they made it very clear that Ukraine, which is roughly the size of Texas and the United States, could never be a member of NATO, that simply presented too much of a danger. They made that clear in 2008 at Budapest. We ignored it. And then subsequently, Mr. Putin has given speeches reiterating the criticality of neutrality for Ukraine, unwilling to see NATO bases there. In 2014, one of the principal reasons that he intervened to seize Crimea was to prevent that naval base from falling into the hands of what he expected would be NATO forces. And remember, whenever he says NATO, he ultimately means the United States. It's the United States Navy that would have gone into the ports in Crimea. It's the United States Armed Forces that is moving eastward towards the Russian border. And we've chosen not to discuss that. 2014, you also had this coup that we helped to organize and implement, which put people in power that otherwise would never have gotten there. And these people were violently anti-Russian, hostile to Russian national security interests. We encouraged that. We cultivated it. We began pouring money into this thing called the Ukrainian army. Really, it's more the army than anything else. And in 2014, this fledgling Ukrainian army began immediately attacking the Russians in eastern Ukraine, in the so-called provinces or oblasts of Donetsk and Lugansk. And in the time between the first attacks by artillery in 2014 and the intervention by the Russians in February of 2022, they killed 14,000 people. And they fired thousands and thousands of rounds of artillery. In fact, in the week or two just before the Russians finally moved in, they fired over 2,000 rounds of artillery ammunition. And these were all being fired at Russian civilians. Now, notice I say Russian civilians. They were technically Ukrainian citizens. They just happened to be Russians. And, of course, these Russians were being oppressed. They were effectively presented with a fait accompli. Either you become Ukrainian, you stop speaking Russian, you speak Ukrainian, you write in Ukrainian, and you adopt Ukrainian identity and culture and so forth, or we're going to punish you. And so the Russians in eastern Ukraine have been second or third class citizens now for years. All of this did not go down well in Russia, as you can imagine. And then, of course, we had this thing called the Minsk Accords, which was, in theory, presented to the Russians as a way to get past the conflict and maintain some measure of civility and peace in Ukraine. Well, it didn't work, and it didn't work, as we've discovered, because first Chancellor Merkel, who's now retired, and then subsequently Mr. Macron, the president of France, both admitted the whole thing was a hoax. It was simply a device to buy time for the Ukrainians to build their forces up. And it became very clear to the Russians that this large force, which is extremely well equipped and I would argue reasonably well trained, certainly by NATO standards, was poised to launch an attack at Russia with the goal of crushing the Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk and then ultimately retaking Crimea. So the Russians said, no, thank you. And they intervened. The big mistake they made is that they assumed that someone was willing to negotiate with them. And so they went in with a really small force, no more than 90,000 on the ground in terms of combat troops. And they discovered after 2 or 3 months, 4 months, even though they were not taking heavy casualties as originally reported, they took very light casualties. It was the Ukrainians that had begun taking heavy casualties almost from the beginning. They discovered that they weren't going to get a negotiated settlement. Finally, the generals met with Putin last summer and said, this is a war. This is not what we bargained for. We miscalculated. The underlying assumptions were wrong. There is no one to talk to. And you'll recall that shortly after your former prime minister's visit in April to Mr. Zelensky, that any hope of talks was crushed. And ultimately, they said we've got to get ready for a real war. That meant mobilizing reserves, expanding the size of the army, training everybody up, re-equipping people, because the equipment they used initially was almost all obsolescent. So that was completed by Christmas. Then there was pressure to launch an offensive, but the weather didn't cooperate, so the decision was made, since we don't have firm ground, and you recall that in that part of the world you have this thing called the Rasputitsa, which is effectively a sea of mud that makes it virtually impassable for armored fighting vehicles or wheeled vehicles. If you leave the hard surface road, you're in big trouble. If you go back to World War II, you find that the major offensives were either launched in the dead of winter when the ground was frozen, or they were launched in June, July, August, September timeframe. So the Russians then said, fine, we'll build an impregnable defense, hold what we've got, and invite the Ukrainians to attack us. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians have taken terrible, terrible losses. And these losses have never been truthfully reported in the Western media, because I think Washington was very concerned that if it became clear that the Ukrainians were dying at great numbers, their forces were being destroyed almost faster than they could be fielded, that support for this insane notion of waging a proxy war on the backs of the Ukrainian people against Russia would no longer be supported in NATO. So the easy solution was lie. And then you have a compliant media that is ideologically aligned with the globalist neocon governments in the West, especially Washington and London, and it becomes very easy to tailor the message to somehow or another sustain support. And remember, Russia still has the legacy of the Cold War behind it, and what that means is that it's easy to convince people that Russians are bad, Russians are evil. After all, wasn't the Soviet Union bad and evil? Of course, this is not the Soviet Union. This country today is radically different. If anything, it is extremely religious, culturally conservative, and I think the Russian military, contrary to what's being reported in the Western media, has behaved extraordinarily well, is not guilty of 90% of the war crimes of which it's being accused. On the other hand, the Ukrainian military has behaved atrociously and murdered people in large numbers and celebrated it in Nazi fashion. So at the end of the day, this is an empire of lies. Now, here's some good news. Empires of lies create truth bombs, and the truth bombs are beginning to explode. And I'm sure that you're aware of the leaked documents, but also more and more information from the battlefield is slipping through. Reporters who are not part of the mainstream are there, and they're telling the truth. So it's harder and harder to maintain the fiction that the Ukrainians are winning, that the Ukrainians ever could win, that the Russians are losing, and the Russians are incompetent, incapable, and stupid, just as it's become impossible to argue that the Russian economy has been harmed at all by the sanctions. On the contrary, the Russian economy is doing quite well. So I think that's where we are right now. The Russian military is waiting for the ground to dry. More Ukrainians are attacking. They've lost now at least 300,000 dead. I've seen higher estimates than that. The Russians are looking at perhaps 30,000 killed in action and perhaps 40, 50,000 wounded. But the difference between Russian wounded and Ukrainian wounded is that Russian wounded are quickly evacuated, their wounds are treated, and they're returned to duty, about 90% of them. Whereas the Ukrainian side doesn't do that as well, can't do it as well, and large numbers of people are dying of wounds on the battlefield. So it's a treacherous situation. I think it's a humanitarian crisis. We haven't even discussed the tens of millions of people whose lives are destroyed in Ukraine. 11 million plus have now left the country. I've seen estimates that suggest that they started with 34.5 million in the country. They're down now to somewhere around 18 or 19 million. And the Ukrainians that are coming out now and have been coming out from the beginning all report they have no intention of going back. And we haven't even begun to address the child trafficking and trafficking of women that has gone on without a break, and the black market for much of the material that we've sent over there. And obviously the squandering of cash that ends up in bank accounts in places like Cyprus belonging to people like Zelensky and the key figures in his operation, including generals in the Ukrainian army, even down to the battalion level. This is a disaster. We should put a stop to it right away and try to rescue as much of Ukraine as we can.